Welcome to today's Explainer class. I'm going to be your guest paleontologist today, and we're taking a trip deep into the history of how biological circuitry actually evolved. We're talking about the journey from ancient primordial seas all the way to the magnificent, complex minds we study today. Trust me, it is an absolutely incredible story of survival, adaptation, and sheer biological ingenuity. Let's dive right in.
Here's our syllabus and evolutionary roadmap for today. We'll start with the deep history of nerves, then reading the fossil record, look at crocodile brains, explore the decentralized mind of the octopus, and finally, human brain plasticity.
Section 1. Deep History of Nerves, from simple sensing to coordinated movement.
Okay, let's rewind the clock, about a billion years. Before we can even begin to understand complex thought or neuroplasticity, we really need to figure out why life on Earth even bothered to invent a nervous system in the first place. The molecular foundations of early nerves appeared roughly 700 million years ago. But the real game changer? The Cambrian explosion, about 500 million years ago. This era literally forced nerves to cluster together into primitive brain hubs because organisms were suddenly moving through 3D space and dealing with wild new sensory inputs, like vision. And to put things into perspective on our own evolutionary branch, it wasn't until a mere 2.5 million years ago, which is practically yesterday in deep time, that a chance mutation allowed human ancestor brains to rapidly balloon in size.
So here is the crucial takeaway. Brains didn't just pop up so ancient organisms could sit around pondering the universe, right? They were purely physical processors. They were engineered to calculate sensory data and translate it into split-second action-shaping muscle movement. I mean, just think about it. Moving a multicellular body without accidentally tearing your own muscles apart requires incredible timing. Plus, the shift to bilateral symmetry, having a distinct front, back, left, and right, provided an obvious spot for sensory organs to gather, at the front. This meant early organisms desperately needed a centralized hub to handle the massive flood of data from the Cambrian information revolution brought on by those very first complex eyes.
Section 2. Reading the fossil record. Tracking brains in ancient stone.
Now you might be wondering, since squishy brain tissue is essentially soft organic matter that almost never fossilizes, how do we paleontologists actually know any of this? Well, we use endocasts. An endocast is basically a three-dimensional mold. It's created naturally when sediments slowly fill the empty cavity of an ancient skull over millions of years. When we excavate the fossil, this internal mold reveals the shape, the size, and the structure of the long-decayed brain that used to live inside. They're essentially natural 3D scans of fossilized ghosts. It's so cool.
And get this, the level of detail is sometimes mind-blowing. Take a look at this quote describing a 130-million-year-old dinosaur endocast related to the iguanodon found over in England. Against all odds, this stone cast actually contained impressions of blood vessels and capillaries thinner than a human hair. It even had textures of cortex tissue. This proves absolutely that incredibly complex vascular systems were already fueling these ancient reptilian computers. It shows us just how far back advanced brain architecture really goes.
Section 3. Crocodiles. Rigid instinctual brains, the peak of ancestral efficiency.
So that brings us to our first specific case study. It's a living fossil that proves a brain doesn't actually have to be big to be devastatingly effective. 200 million years. The modern crocodile is an apex ambush predator running on a brain that has remained virtually unchanged for that entire immense time span. It is a perfectly honed organic circuit built entirely for survival. It really goes to show that evolution doesn't always demand endless growth if the original design is already flawless. When we pit these two evolutionary strategies against each other, the differences are striking. The crocodile happily trades away the extremely high metabolic cost of conscious contemplation. They don't have a large, complex cerebral cortex. Instead, they operate a brain the size of a walnut, literally a walnut. It's dominated by the brainstem and runs purely on raw instinct and immediate reflexive action. Mammalian brains, on the other hand, demand a massive physical footprint and a huge metabolic expense to support the complex memories, moods, and prolonged contemplation we experience. The crocodile has absolutely no need for anxious searching or existential dread about yesterday. It relies on a ruthless, stripped-down, lightning-fast reflex that has kept it at the very top of the food chain for sure.
Section 4. Octopuses, the decentralized mind. Alien architecture of the deep.
Okay, let's completely shift gears here. Roughly 750 million years ago, cephalopods branched off from us and took a totally decentralized approach to intelligence.
It's a fascinating split in evolutionary problem solving. While we humans rely on a strict top-down centralized command center right in our heads, cephalopods, like the octopus, utilize a distributed network. The insane reality is that the vast majority of an octopus's neurons actually live within specialized mini-brains, or ganglia, inside their 8 tentacles. Their arms possess enough independent neurons to literally have minds of their own. They're capable of autonomous control and complex problem-solving completely independent of the central hub.
Okay, fun fact time, and it's a wild one. This bizarre alien architecture comes with some truly bizarre consequences. Octopuses possess a central brain, sure, but it is donut-shaped and it wraps entirely around their food pipe. Because of this layout, if they swallow a meal that is a little too large, they can actually inflict brain damage upon themselves. So, while this decentralized architecture grants them incredible flexibility and localized intelligence in those arms, it certainly comes with some fascinating and incredibly dangerous biological trade-offs. But why on earth did they evolve this way? Well, it all comes down to environmental challenges. Picture this. Roughly 330 million years ago, cephalopods lost their heavy protective outer shells. This sudden physical vulnerability meant they desperately needed rapid, complex bodily coordination just to survive without their armor. They found themselves in a highly unique niche where they were small enough to be prey but just large enough to act as predators. That dual pressure drove a rapid convergent evolution, pushing them toward a remarkable, highly adaptable sentience just to outsmart threats on the reef. It's a brand of cognitive brilliance entirely separate from our mammalian branch.
Section 5. Humans, Centralized Plastic Processors. The Metabolic Cost of Sentience.
Climbing back up to our own branch of the evolutionary tree, we often look at a classic biology classroom example to understand our massive, centralized brain hubs. The 1848 medical case of Phineas Gage. You've probably heard this one. Gage survived a horrifying accident where a meter-long iron tamping rod blasted straight through his skull, completely destroying his left frontal lobe. Astoundingly, his physical abilities remained intact, but his personality drastically shifted. He became impulsive, impatient, and unrecognizable to his friends. But here is the absolute miracle of this story. Over the next decade, his brain adapted. It literally rewired itself, eventually restoring a ton of his social functioning.
We call this neuroplasticity. It's the biological ability of the brain to continually heal, remap itself, and form brand new neural connections to circumvent damage. Unlike the rigid, 200-million-year-old instinctual hard drive of the crocodile we talked about earlier, our human minds are not static at all. We exist in a constant, dynamic state of rewiring. This is exactly what allows us to adapt to entirely novel environments and totally unexpected challenges.
But hey, this incredible neuroplasticity and sapience, it absolutely does not come for free. Our centralized brains run on about 20 watts of power. Now that might not sound like much, but they demand a massive 20% of our total oxygen and daily energy intake. It is a wildly expensive organ to keep running. For a primitive primate trying to navigate a harsh prehistoric world, dedicating a full fifth of your total energy just to power your thoughts, that was a massive evolutionary gamble.
So how did we even afford to scale this processor up? It was a very specific combination of anatomical innovations and environmental adaptations. First, bipedalism freed up our ancestors' hands for complex tool usage. Then, right around 2.5 million years ago, a chance genetic mutation weakened our incredibly powerful jaw muscles. Now, why does that matter? Well, it released the physical constraints on the skull and allowed the brain cavity room to physically expand. A larger brain meant better tool use, which meant hunting larger, nutrient-dense animals. And finally, the real game changer, the taming of fire. Cooking meat unlocked a massive caloric goldmine. It provided the extremely dense energy we needed to fuel these 20-watt processors and shift us away from reflexive survival toward complex, conscious decision-making. Right, let's summarize today's biology lesson with a quick cheat sheet. We've seen how wildly different evolutionary pressures shaped 3 entirely distinct biological computers. You've got the crocodile, relying on a centralized, stripped-down brain driven by apex ambush survival, giving it a rigid, ancient instinct. Then you've got the octopus, utilizing a decentralized network driven by physical vulnerability, creating an autonomous and incredibly adaptable mind. And finally, humans. We rely on a massive, highly centralized hub driven by social and tool complexity, resulting in our neuroplastic, sapient nature.
I'm going to leave you today with this one last, slightly provocative thought to ponder. The evidence shows that over the last 100,000 years, the human brain has actually shrunk by 13%. That's right, shrunk. So as our brains continue to physically diminish in volume, are we losing our ancestral sharpness because our complex societal safety nets keep us alive without needing to be brilliant? Or, much like the dynamic nature of neuroplasticity itself, is our organic processor simply optimizing? Is it just becoming ruthlessly efficient for the future, like a perfectly tuned machine? It's a fascinating question. Thank you so much for joining me in class today for this explainer, and keep exploring.